The morning Felicity Horne walked into a pawn shop with her grandmother's nursing pin and a silver star she had no right to sell, she told herself it was just temporary. That was the word she used, temporary. Like she was parking a car, not dismantling the last proof that any of it had happened. The pin was small, 14-karat gold, shaped like a lamp, the kind Florence Nightingale carried in paintings. Her grandmother had worn it for 31 years at Mercy General in Dayton. When she died, she pressed it into Felicity's hand and said, "You'll earn one of your own someday." Felicity had. She'd earned it twice over. And, still, she stood at the corner of Route 9 and Callister in Braddock Falls, Ohio, looking at a neon sign that said, "Cash for gold. We buy everything," thinking temporary. She had $43 in her checking account. Rent was due in 8 days. Her car insurance had lapsed 3 weeks ago. She hadn't told anyone. Bob had ended 6 months earlier, in November, on a Tuesday, which felt like an insult. Not even a Friday, not even the grace of a weekend to absorb the blow. Felicity had been a trauma nurse at Braddock Regional for 4 years. She was 31 years old, and she was good. Not just competent good, but the kind of good that attending physicians noticed, the kind where charge nurses called her specifically when something went sideways in Bay 3. She had a feel for it. A preceptor had told her that in her first year, some people can learn this work and some people are born for it. And you're the second kind. And Felicity had carried that with her through every double shift, every code, every family in the waiting room she had to face at 2 in the morning. The Silver Star had come before nursing school. Most people didn't know that about her. She'd served 2 tours as a combat medic with the Army, attached to a forward surgical team in Afghanistan. She'd been 23 the first time she stabilized a man whose femoral artery had been partially severed by shrapnel, lying in the dirt 50 yards from where a firefight was still happening. She'd gotten the medal for that, and for 3 other things she didn't talk about at parties. She came home at 25, enrolled in an accelerated BSN program on the GI Bill, and never mentioned any of it unless someone asked directly. She wasn't the kind of person who led with her service. Wasn't the point. The point had always been the work. The work ended because of a man named Dressel, supervisor of nursing operations, 3rd floor, a man who wore lanyards with motivational phrases on them and scheduled mandatory resilience training on the same weeks he cut overtime. Dressel had been building a case against Felicity for 8 months. She understood that now, looking back. At the time she'd thought the write-ups were administrative noise, the kind of paper trail that hospitals generated constantly to cover liability. Late charting on a night, she'd had 6 critical patients simultaneously. A family complaint from a man who'd been upset that his mother wasn't improving fast enough, as though Felicity personally controlled the progression of septic shock. Minor things. She'd responded to each one in writing, documented her reasoning, done everything right. October, a patient coded in her bay. She and the resident on call worked for 19 minutes. They didn't save him. He was 77 years old with end-stage COPD and 3 previous cardiac events, and they still worked 19 minutes because that was what you did. Dressel reviewed the code afterward and flagged what he called a protocol deviation in her epinephrine timing. The resident who'd been standing next to her, making the same calls, was not flagged. The resident was in his 2nd year and his name was Fowler, and he was, incidentally, the nephew of the hospital's chief of staff. Felicity knew better than to say that out loud. She said it anyway, in the review meeting, quietly and with documentation. 2 weeks later, she was called into HR and told her position was being eliminated as part of a departmental restructuring. They gave her 2 weeks severance and a form to sign. She didn't sign it. That decision cost her the severance. Also cost her the positive reference letter they'd offered as part of the package. What it bought her was the right to say, out loud and in writing, that what had happened was wrong, though saying so, she would discover, had no immediate practical effect whatsoever. The unemployment claim was denied twice. The appeals process required documentation she was still trying to gather. Applied to 14 hospitals within driving distance and gotten 3 interviews, none of which progressed past the first round. She'd later learn, through a nursing school friend who knew someone in HR at one of those hospitals, that Braddock Regional was providing what they called a neutral reference, meaning they confirmed dates of employment and said nothing else. which, in the way these things worked, functioned like a red flag without being one. By February, she was selling furniture. The dining table went first, then the second dresser, then the small television she'd had since graduate school. She ate a lot of rice and canned beans and told herself she was saving money on groceries, which was a way of not saying she was rationing. She walked to the library 3 days a week to use the internet because she'd suspended her home service. The silver star was in a box in her closet, with her discharge papers and a folded photograph of her team from Kandahar. She hadn't opened the box in 2 years. She opened it in March, on a night when she sat on the floor of her kitchen because she'd sold the chairs, and she looked at the metal for a long time. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the 19 minutes in Bay 3, thought about Fowler, who was probably still working, who had probably already forgotten her name. Then she put the metal in her coat pocket and went to bed. The pawn shop on Route 9 was called Reardon's. It had been there since the 90s, according to the sign, and it smelled like metal and old carpet. There was a glass case full of guitars and camera equipment near the door, and behind the counter an older man with reading glasses on a chain was marking something in a ledger. He looked up when she came in but didn't say anything, which she appreciated. She put the nursing pin on the counter first. Then, after a moment, the silver star. He looked at both of them for a long time. He picked up the star carefully, the way people handled things they weren't sure about, and turned it over. "Army?" he said. "Yes." "Combat?" "Yes." He set it down. "I'll give you 80 for the pin and 220 for the medal. That's what I can do. $300, 8 days of breathing room." She was reaching for the star to hand it over when the door opened. She heard the dog before she saw it, not barking, just the sound of nails on linoleum, purposeful and quick. Then a German shepherd was standing next to her, so close she could feel the warmth off its flank, and its head was down over the glass case, nose working, and it had gone completely still. Not still like it was resting, still like it had found something. Ranger. A man's voice, low and controlled, "Heel." The dog didn't move. He was in his late 30s, maybe 40, wearing a gray long-sleeve shirt and jeans, and he had the particular posture of someone who had spent years training themselves to take up exactly the space they needed, and no more. He walked to the dog and put his hand on its collar, and Ranger allowed this but kept his head down over the counter, over the silver star. "I'm sorry," the man said to Felicity. Usually. He stopped. He was looking at the metal. She watched something shift in his face. "That's a silver star," he said. "I know what it is. It's yours?" She didn't answer right away, and in the pause, Ranger made a sound. Not a whine, more like a single quiet note, something between distress and recognition, and pressed his nose gently to the glass above the metal. "Yes," she said. "It's mine." The man straightened up, looked at her for a moment, then at the man behind the counter, then back at her. "I'm Declan Ford," he said. "I was with SEAL Team 7. 2 tours." She didn't say anything. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "But I'd like to ask you one question, if that's okay." She waited. Is this the last resort? Or is there somewhere else to go?" It was such a precise question that she felt it the way you feel unexpected cold, sharp and immediate. Nobody had asked her that in 6 months. Nobody had phrased it that way. She'd had people tell her things would work out, and people tell her to apply to more places, and people offer to pray for her, but no one had stood in front of her and asked whether she had options left. "This is the last resort," she said. Ford looked at the counter. He looked at the nursing pin, the star. He reached into his pocket and put $320 on the glass. "Don't sell them," he said. "What I have on me. I'll get more." She stared at the money. "I don't want charity. It's not charity. I'm asking you to stay here for 20 minutes and tell me what happened." He pulled up a stool from near the wall and set it next to the counter. "Ranger's not going to let you leave anyway." The dog had sat down. He was leaning against her leg with a steadiness that felt almost deliberate, like ballast. She stayed. She told him about Dressel and the write-ups and the code and Fowler. She told him about the HR meeting and the form she hadn't signed. She told him about the 14 applications and the neutral reference and the unemployment appeals. She told him about selling the furniture. She did not intend to tell him all of this. She had not told most of it to anyone, but Ford listened the way certain people listen, without inserting himself, without moving to fix anything before she was done, and something about that made her keep going. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have documentation," he said. "It wasn't a question. I have everything. Every write-up with my responses. The timeline of the code. Fuller's file from the same review period, which I requested under hospital policy, and they had to give me. Did you have a lawyer look at any of it?" "I talked to one. She said, I had a case, but it would take 18 months and $20,000 I don't have." "What's her name?" Felicity told him. He took out his phone and made a note. Then he said, "There's a Veterans Legal Services org in Columbus. I did some work with them a few years ago. Employment discrimination cases for vets at no cost, and they've won some significant ones. The fact that the resident who made the same calls wasn't disciplined, and that he's connected to hospital administration, that's a pattern they know how to build a case around." He paused. "If you're willing." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He thought about that. "Ranger found you," he said, which was not really an answer, and which she understood anyway. The organization was called Valor Bridge Legal Services, and the attorney who called her the following Thursday was a woman named Oswald, who had a voice like a closing argument, and who, in their first 40-minute phone call, identified 3 specific violations of Ohio employment law that Felicity had not known to name. The wrongful termination claim was filed 9 weeks later. In the interim, Ford had also connected her with a nurse staffing agency that placed traveling nurses in short-term trauma positions. No reference check required, credentials-based placement, immediate income. She started working again in April, 12 days after their conversation at Reardon's. Night shifts at a hospital in Zanesville, 45 minutes away. Drove there in a car. Ford had helped her get running again, a thing that involved him and 2 of his friends spending a Saturday in her parking lot with tools she didn't own. She tried to pay him back. He declined in the specific way people decline when being paid back is not the point. Ranger came with him to the parking lot that Saturday, and at some point the dog settled next to Felicity's feet while she held a flashlight and watched men who knew what they were doing do it. She scratched behind his ears without thinking about it, and he pressed into her hand with the full weight of his head. The discovery process in the lawsuit turned up things that went further than Felicity had known. Through requests for personnel records, Oswald's team identified a pattern. 4 nurses terminated in the previous 3 years under similar circumstances, all of them with documented conflict with Dressel, or in departments where administration had a financial interest in cutting senior staff. 2 of those nurses had signed the form. Felicity hadn't signed. Their cases were settled confidentially and cheaply. The other 2, like Felicity, had refused. One of them had filed an EEOC complaint that had stalled. Oswald brought all 4 women together. 3 agreed to be part of a consolidated complaint. The 4th was still under the terms of her confidential settlement and couldn't speak publicly, but she provided a signed affidavit. The hospital's legal team spent 2 months trying to make the case about Felicity's performance. They submitted the same documentation she'd seen before, the write-ups, the code review. What they had not anticipated was that Oswald had obtained Fowler's personnel file through discovery, and that it contained, among other things, a note from the Chief of Staff's office requesting that the October code review not include attending or resident staff, written 6 days before the review took place. When that document appeared in a deposition, the hospital's lead counsel asked for a recess. The settlement was reached 11 weeks later. Felicity could not disclose the amount. What she could say, what was part of the terms she had insisted on, was that Dressel was no longer employed by Braddock Regional, that a formal review of nursing department oversight had been initiated by the hospital board, and that the neutral reference policy had been ended. She called her mother when it was done, or she sat in the parking lot of the Zanesville hospital after a night shift and told her what had happened, most of it, the parts that didn't require a law degree to understand. Her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "I wish your grandmother could have heard this." Felicity looked at the nursing pin she'd clipped back to her badge the week before. The weight of it was familiar now. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like. She'd have had opinions, Felicity said. She'd have been furious, her mother said. And then she'd have been so proud. The traveling nurse position in Zanesville turned into a staff offer she accepted 6 months later. Different hospital, different city, closer to Columbus, which was not an accident. Valor Bridge Legal Services had mentioned they sometimes needed nurses willing to speak to other veterans navigating employment disputes, and Felicity had said yes before she finished processing the question. She ran into Ford twice more in the months that followed, once at a fundraiser for a veterans housing organization in Columbus, and once entirely by accident at a gas station off I-70. Both times, Ranger recognized her before Ford did, or at least demonstrated it more openly, crossing the distance between them at a pace that Ford called unprofessional, and which Felicity considered the highest compliment she'd received that year. The Silver Star was back where it belonged, in a shadow box on the wall of her apartment, next to the photograph from Kandahar. The nursing pin was on her badge every shift. She'd started telling new nurses about her grandmother, about the lamp, about what the pin meant, not as a speech. Just when it came up naturally, when she could see someone struggling with the weight of the work and needing to understand why it mattered. She'd learned that from Ford, in a way. The way he'd ask the right question at the right moment. Not what happened, but is this the last resort? The way he'd made space for her to answer it honestly. Some people came to this work trained, and some people were born for it. She'd believed that once about nursing. Why? She'd come to believe it about something larger, too. The work of recognizing when someone deserving was about to disappear, and choosing, at the cost of nothing more than 20 minutes and whatever cash was in your pocket, to make sure they didn't. Ranger, for his part, received